Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Gateway GIS Virtual Forum. And I'm so proud to present Tyler Cargill, who
Testing one, two, three.
Yes, he is the chemical engineering student that I, mentioned to some of you, and a lot of you all saw on the flyer. And of course, he's now ready to talk with us, and let's all get engaged in the conversation, you all, about what's going on with GIS, air pollution, and environmental racism. So at this point, I will turn it over to Tyler, and as we get into the conversation, those of you who may want to put your thoughts in the chat room, you can. And for those of you who want to, more importantly, jump right in and get into the flow of the conversation, just unmute and let us know. Okay. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started with you, Tyler, and good morning again, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. Tyler, it's on you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Norman. So hello everyone, my name is Tyler. I am a WashU first year PhD student. I'm gonna share my screen right now. Let's see. And for the talk I'll be doing today, I'll be talking about the applications of GIS, looking at problems such as air pollution, and how this falls underneath the underlying theme of environmental racism in the St. Louis city area. So thank you all for attending. I'm very excited to be able to talk about this and hope you're able to learn, and I'm able to learn from you all as well. So before I want to start, I want to get to be able to know a little bit about me. Just helps to be able to know about the background of whoever's presenting, helps to be able to engage with the conversation a little bit more. So I was actually born and raised in Wichita, Kansas. Typically when I say that, people are like, what? So Wichita, Kansas actually, it's the biggest city in Kansas, since Kansas City is split up between Kansas and Missouri. I'm also an avid cycler. You're likely to find me riding around Forest Park all the time. I love to do that as a free time. I studied abroad in Tanzania, and this picture in the top right. You see that's from my time there. So I speak Swahili. I've been trying to find some Swahili speaking community in St. Louis. And if anyone wants to try and learn, please hit me up afterwards. I'll be glad to do some lessons. I've been vegan for 4 years. Luckily, St. Louis has some great spots. Sweet Arts is a Black-owned vegan place that I love going to. And this last thing about me transitions into the conversation that I'll be having now. I'm very emphatic on trying to find environmental applications of engineering and try and find the solutions that are able to resolve these issues. So for my talk today, I want to first start off by talking about what actually is environmental racism. And so I have two pictures to try and display what it looks like visually. And so on the right, what we have here is a place that seems to be more maintained, more high quality buildings, more landscape, more greenery. And on the left, we have some deteriorating buildings. You see the landscape not as properly maintained. So if I was to pose the question, which picture on the left or the right would you say shows the house that's most likely to be in North St. Louis? Which one do you think it is? So you can put your answers in the chat. If you think the house on the left is more likely to be in North St. Louis, if you think the house on the right is more likely to be in North St. Louis, you can go ahead and put that in the chat.
Okay, I'm seeing some answers here. Okay.
So yeah, Dr. Norman, you can just let me know the general answers that you see whenever they start coming in.
Okay. So far, the answers I'm getting is on the left.
On the left. And that's something that I expect to see, and that's a sign of environmental racism occurring because you all are able to predict, without even knowing beforehand the location, which one you would think would be in North St. Louis. And that's a sign of inequities existing in the geography of a location. Ideally, you wouldn't be able to predict which house is where. In an ideal scenario, you would like to say, well, this house could be anywhere in St. Louis. But we know it's more likely to be in North St. Louis, and that's a sign of inequities. And due to the demographics that exist in the North St. Louis area, that means certain types of people are more likely to be living in these conditions in comparison to the conditions on the right. So as I said, environmental racism is related to the inequities in the living conditions of groups of people. And how it continues and how it's worsened is through racist policies. And so racist policies include actions such as the usage of money to help make communities more privileged while ignoring other communities and not meeting their needs. But it's also a byproduct of inaction as well. So some people might say some people aren't culpable if they don't do anything, but it's quite the opposite in my opinion. If people are knowing of these inequities in the living conditions, but they still choose not to act, then they're just as culpable. That means they don't care and they're okay with people living in these conditions. So that's how environmental racism occurs and continues to occur. And victims are often of the minority background or financially underprivileged background. So that means these actions are occurring because people, in a sense, are saying, due to someone's race, they aren't deserving of being protected from environmental hazards. And that's, of course, something that's very terrible and needs to be changed. And the bad part about this environmental racism is that it's so widespread and often sometimes invisible, it leaves people kind of trapped in these situations and unable to get help and free themselves or be freed from these situations. And one of the big things that people think about when it comes to environmental racism is lead. And so one of the pictures that I showed is something that you might think of when I talk about lead. You think about Flint, Michigan. So we all know what happened with Flint. They ended up switching their water supply from the Detroit water to the Flint River to save costs, but they didn't properly treat it. So the water ended up corroding the inside of the pipes and caused this discoloration. And so people were concerned about the water quality because of the color, but the color wasn't actually due to lead. That was due to rust coming off the interior of the surface. So people in Flint, it's weird to say this, actually got lucky that the rust was coming off, because if lead was just coming into the pipes or lead was just coming off the pipes and no rust, the water would have still been the same color. So people wouldn't have been able to tell what was actually in the water. It was due to the rust that people were able to figure out something was wrong with the water, and they then found out lead was in the water too. And that's the problem with lead. It can be an invisible pollutant and it's very dangerous. So for example, in St. Louis, the primary hazard for lead is paint. So before the 1980s, a lot of indoor paints contained lead. And after that, after learning about the hazards of lead, it became banned. But now, since St. Louis City contains so many houses that were built before the 1980s, there's still a lot of houses that contain lead, unfortunately, in the paint. And paint that's improperly maintained with time starts to deteriorate. On this top right, you can see the paint can start to chip away, and these chips can fall on the ground. It can eventually become finer particles, get in the dust. And this is very dangerous for those who are exposed to lead, especially because it causes detrimental health effects for children. So it's known to cause behavioral problems. People are more prone to act out, maybe not be more impulsive, less rational. It also impairs brain development, making it difficult for people to learn. It can also cause miscarriages. So when you think about how a child interacts in a home, they're typically on the ground, crawling around, maybe playing with some toys. So they're more likely to come across these lead chips, ingest them, breathe this dust on the ground, play with toys, put them in their mouth. And so kids can be more at risk for lead and exposing them, and thus getting detrimental effects as well. And so these are two GIS maps that show the visual disparities in who's getting exposed to lead and the effects of that in the St. Louis City area. This was prepared by the Department of Health. So this is by ward. These boundaries are, these dashed lines show the wards in St. Louis City. And the darker shades of the blue indicate people living in that area who have higher levels of lead in their blood. So the darker the blue, the more lead in the blood of people in that area. And these circles, these black circles, indicate violent, or the rate at which violence happens in these certain wards. So the larger the circle, the more violence in the area. So that's for the left. On the right, these circles indicate poverty. So based on what you're seeing from these graphs, does anyone have any ideas on what this is telling us, what these graphs are, or what these figures are telling us? And if you want to say it in the chat, you can go ahead, or you can unmute yourself and introduce yourself and tell us your ideas.
Okay, who wants to be brave enough to get started with this? Okay, unmute and feel free to jump right in.
I was going to say that my name was Malik Andrews. I was going to ask you to repeat his question again before I answer.
Yeah, so my question is, based on what you're seeing from these graphs, what can you take away from the information that's being presented, knowing that in the darker areas, these are where people have higher levels of blood or higher levels of lead in their blood. And also these dark circles right here, the larger the black circles are, the more violence there is in an area. And over here, the larger the black circles are, the more poverty there are. So based on what you see where lead is more prevalent at, what can you take away from these graphs?
Okay. Tyler, before we go any further, there's some feedback in your mic. So if you can adjust that, please.
Okay, yeah.
Right,
How's it sounding? What's it sound like?
I can hear it's sort of like one of those type of pipe-like sounds. You know, it's part of the feedback in your mic.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay,
No.
let's go ahead with someone who wants to give their interpretation of the maps that are here on the screen, please.
Right. Like I was saying, my name was Malik Andrews, and like basically from what I can interpret from both maps is that really due to all these levels of blood poisoning, blood lead poisoning, it also seems to cause an effect where these individuals that live there also have issues, and like these also issues span from the same problems of, impulsiveness, where it sounds like, where we have more crimes there. And even then, you also got to take into account that like, even then with all this stuff that's going on, like there's already been a form of systematic racism going along. So you stack 2 and 2 together and it just amplifies that current situation going on down the line, and just leads to more neglect towards other families. And then, there's more impulsiveness, and it's just more unfair systematic racism in both fronts.
Okay, Malik, did you tell him that you were a student at Clyde C. Miller?
Oh, right. I am a junior at Clyde C. Miller Career Academy. I'm currently in a pathway with Mr. Bass.
Okay, thank you. Okay, who else?
This is James Page, and I serve as Executive Director of the St. Louis Downtown Neighborhood Association, and I am Alderman-elect of the 5th Ward as of last Tuesday's race. And I see the correlation indicated by the graphs, but I'm hoping that this discussion will share a little bit more in-depth relationship between the blood poisoning levels and violent crime and poverty. I would like to learn more about that. I hope it's included in this presentation, or there's follow-up research that correlates these phenomena.
Okay, that sounds great. Can I chime in? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, well, my name is Darius Pikes, and I am I'm an educator presently in East St. Louis, Illinois. I work for District 189. I work as the data management and student engagement coordinator. I've been working in education for about 20 years. And what I've noticed in my career as an educator is that from the time I started in 1999, 2000, I actually have seen a gradual decrease in the intellectual capacity of students. I've had the fortunate opportunity of teaching every grade from kindergarten through college, and it wasn't sequential. I didn't start at kindergarten and then go to the top. I actually kind of started middle school, then went to college, and then taught high school. And my last tour of duty as an educator, I taught the elementary school grades. And I was totally astonished that in my kindergarten classroom, that I had 32 students, and 50% of those students had learning disabilities. They were literally, I hate to use the term, they were mentally challenged. Their motor skills were off. They had anger issues. They were violent. They, openly defiant. I truly believe that there's a strong correlation with blood poisoning, with the pollution in the areas that they live in. And I'll say this and I'll wrap up. The pictures that the speaker showed, I live in North St. Louis, and I totally live there by choice. And the house that you showed with the bricks missing in the back, I've passed that house probably 1,000 times. And it's just astonishing to me that, because I truly believe there is a direct correlation between blood poison levels and crime, especially when you start talking about lead poisoning, because one thing that lead poisoning does, it actually causes a decrease in IQ, and it also causes violent behavior.
Thank you, Darius. Anyone else?
Yes, hello, Dr. Norman. My name is William Winston. I'm a GIS analyst at Washington University. And I just had a quick question for Tyler. The violence rate points, those are obviously not directly associated with each one of the ward boundaries. I assume those are census tracts. Is that correct, Tyler?
Tyler, did you hear his question?
Sorry, yeah, I had to get my headphones back on. I was adjusting something. But yes, that would be according to census tract data.
Great. Thanks, Tyler.
No problem. So yeah, if there isn't any other comments, I think everyone had some really great input. And so one of the things that we see is that people who live in more impoverished conditions are more likely to have lead in their blood. And this has many detrimental effects. But why is it that these people who are more impoverished are more likely to have lead in their blood? So potentially it's the reasons that they're less able to maintain the quality of their indoor home. So they're more likely to have deteriorating paint, which then affects them to be more likely to have exposure to lead. They could live in areas where landlords are less likely to upkeep these places because they know there isn't concern for poor people and their needs. So landlords don't feel culpable in trying to create safe living conditions. These are all potential applications. And on the left, we saw what the effects are. And Darius mentioned that, for example, lead can cause intellectual disabilities, that can decrease the capacity of people, and that can decrease the educational attainment of people living in these areas. And we also saw, as was mentioned by one person, we want to do more research on whether or not these correlations are actually related to causation. So just because there's more violence in areas where people have higher levels of lead in their blood doesn't mean one's causing the other. But since there's the potential for that, we should look more into it. And if people will say they want to decrease gun violence and violence in these areas in North St. Louis, they should also be considering environmental racism issues as well, because if there's a chance that lead exposure could be causing this, you might as well try and fix the problem, see if it creates things for the better. So this leads us into thinking, well, what should we do regarding lead? I want to have this conversation be focused on actual impact actions that we can take. So right now, there's not enough information on the standards, the indoor living conditions of homes in the St. Louis City area. We should do a citywide housing survey to evaluate the indoor living conditions. And this can be coupled to be able to try and help and reduce the economic disprivileges that some people are exposed to in the St. Louis area. So we know that more people in North St. Louis are impoverished. So how about we recruit and train these people to go home to home, go into these homes, do surveys to look for signs of deteriorating paint, and create these surveys to know which homes are at risk for lead exposure. And then we need funds then to be able to abate these buildings of lead to make sure people are living in safe conditions. But as we mentioned, some landlords don't feel culpable in creating these safe conditions because the penalties right now are very minuscule if you aren't being responsible with trying to make sure lead isn't being potentially exposed to people. So we need harsher penalties for landlords to make sure they're creating safe living conditions. And also for tenants who want to take legal action, we need to make sure they can have some paid legal counsel to make sure that they can hold their landlords accountable. Before I move on, does anyone else have any other thoughts on things that we should do regarding lead?
Okay, Tyler just raised a question for your input. Anyone have any other thoughts?
Well, I think the the examples that Tyler gave were totally were right on point. I think we definitely need citywide surveys to evaluate the indoor living conditions. That definitely, because just like in the area that I live in, a lot of those houses have been there for a long time. I mean, 50, 60, 70 years. And so there's definitely lead paint in some of those houses. And I think his idea of recruiting and training impoverished St. Louisans to perform these surveys is an amazing idea, because, you know, a lot of the people that live in the community, a lot of, you know, they don't, they're not bought into the community because they, you know, because of their poverty. They're not empowered. And I think by empowering St. Louisans in the North City area, and training them so that they know what to look for, I think that's a great idea. And I definitely like the thought that he shared about dedicating funds to abate lead from buildings that pose lead poisoning to children and adults. I think these are all really great ideas. And I think this is something that not only the city of St. Louis could benefit from, but all of the children and its residents. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Darius. Anyone else?
Yes, Tyler, James Page again. I realize the urgency in doing surveys, abating lead and other hazardous materials in occupied housing. And a lot of that, as we know, exists on the north side. Has your group or your research indicated that it's important that we raise or remove houses such as the one on the left in your earlier picture that's obviously not occupied? Those are what I call blighted properties that are beyond their economic life. I think it's important that we remove those, especially those that are not on a historical registry, that we remove those houses and restore that land for potential redevelopment. Of course, that's secondary to improving the housing that houses children. But have you considered that as well?
Yes, that's a very good point. And one of the things that we need to think about is that the construction that happens to break down these buildings releases more air pollution. So lead that was in these buildings, when they get deconstructed, the dust then goes into the air. If there's asbestos in the buildings as well, that also goes into the air. So that could be putting people at risk. And like you said, these buildings could be serving a lot more function if they are revitalized. So I'll be getting into that in the future, or in some later slides, on what's the potential for these abandoned buildings, because right now, like you said, they're past their economic value. So I completely agree.
Laura, Dr. Laura Kellen, you had an interesting question and comment in the chat. Would you please share that with us?
Of course. Yeah, happy to. This is Laura Kellen from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. This is a great presentation, Tyler. I kind of wanted to put it in the chat to leave as much space for our young folks as possible, but I'm happy to verbalize it. I just think this is a very cool vision, training sort of citizen scientists or citizen surveyors. I'm thinking that this might be a really great initiative, way to spend, to put some of the American Rescue Plan funds. And I know that our new fantastic mayor-elect is probably the most sensitive ear to the kind of arguments you're making. So I was just wondering if we have in the room any, I don't know, any way to transmit this fantastic proposal to her.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And I do believe Alderman-elect James Page, you are now a member of the St. Louis Board of Aldermen. So is that something that you can help us with?
Well, one of the reasons for my comments is, and I won't get too deep into this on Tyler's presentation, but addressing blighted buildings in my ward is one of my platform issues, and we can discuss that offline in depth.
Okay. Now, also, I happen to know Alderman-elect Page, that your ward is Ward 5, and in Ward 5 is where there's the construction of the new National Geospatial Intelligence Agency West headquarters. So your ward involves some very interesting developments that are taking place now. And I'm quite sure that's part of the discussion too, as you look at how, you know, the impact of having a major facility like that built in that part of the community that is very much affected by, you know, what Tyler is addressing.
Absolutely. And some of the blighted properties that are referenced border the new NGA facility.
Okay. And so we do need to address this, is what I think, in essence, you're probably going to, you know, deal with, like you said, offline. Okay, gotcha. All right, thanks. Okay, who else? Anyone else before we go to the next part of the presentation? Okay, Tyler, come to you. Oh, Thomas? Okay, go ahead.
Tyler, I wanted to commend you for what you're presenting here, because it's a problem that we've known about in terms of just lead, but you've added some critical and more prioritized dimensions to it. And I think that it will be well received in a light, again, like anything else, especially when you're looking at equity or social justice, in a sense, where those that are willing to listen truly listen, and those that can take action take action. I commend you for that. Also, I wanted to give you a shout out because my alma mater is Washington University, and I started out in chemical engineering before I got into computers, and then found my passion as a teacher. So thank you.
And by the way, Thomas, you forgot to mention that you're at Clyde Military Academy, which is in, I do believe, Ward 3, which is next door to Ward 5. Okay, let's go on, Tyler, so we can get through some of your other.
Yeah, sounds great.
Thank you.
I'm happy to hear about the various backgrounds of the people in the crowd right now, or in the audience, I should say. And Laura, thanks again for bringing up that comment. I'll actually be talking about the rescue funds that St. Louis City have been providing and what we could potentially do with that. And let's go on to the next slide. So another issue that could be solved from some of the action items that I mentioned should be taken when trying to figure out which homes need to be abated from lead is also mold. So this GIS graph that you see here is a result of a figure done by the WashU School, the law school. And so this shows the interior mold complaints in certain wards of the St. Louis City area. And so mold results from improperly maintained homes. If you have leaking roofs, that's gonna make water infiltrate into the home. It's gonna sit there, become stagnant, and cause mold in your interior areas. And that has a lot of negative health consequences. It causes allergic reactions, it can cause asthma. So it really affects the lungs a lot. And so what you see here, again, it's similar patterns. So these impoverished areas are more likely to have these mold complaints. So that means either the homeowners don't have the funds needed to maintain their homes, or landlords aren't taking the necessary steps to be able to make sure that these homes are properly maintained. So again, like I mentioned, the action items, similar steps could be taken for lead. So people surveying homes for lead, but also looking at interiors for mold as well. And so all these issues for lead in the air, we got mold in the air, this is all related to air pollution. But there's other sources of air pollution outside of what's in your interior home. So we have large scale polluters in the St. Louis City area. And this graph on the right, these blue dots are representative of pollution sources that emit pollution on a large scale. So they're registered with the EPA, they have permits, they have to talk about what they're emitting and on what amount, because they emit so much. And so what we see here is that if you tally up all these blue dots based on the ward area, what we find is that large scale polluters are more abundant in majority Black areas. And let me see what the time is. Yeah, we have time. Does anyone have any ideas on why this would be the case? Why are we seeing more large scale polluters in majority Black areas?
Tyler's asking for input. Anyone? What are your thoughts about why are we seeing more large-scale polluters in majority Black areas? Anyone?
It's a no-brainer to me.
Tyler, I will speak to one. And I'm looking at the area that is actually in my ward, which I know better than all of the others. And along the near north side riverfront, that is a heavily industrial area. And I think that may be a source of some of the pollution that goes from downtown going north along the riverfront. That may be a source. I've done no specific research on the matter, but given the graph I'm looking at, that may be a reasonable interpretation.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Page. Anyone else? Okay, let's go on, Tyler.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that input. And one of the reasons that I believe it's related to are some zoning laws that are typically racist in nature. So as we mentioned in these Black areas, there's potentially some abandoned buildings that don't have as much value. So there's less property value. So maybe it's easier for companies to come into these areas, buy up land, and then put their businesses there and then emit. But these decisions are typically allowed by policy regulators and people in power. So there's an action that's happening in the city that's allowing these emitters to be in certain areas. So we have to look at the actions, the policies that are in place that are allowing these businesses to flourish in certain areas, but not allowed to do businesses in others. And so these emissions have, and considering this is very important because these emissions have various types of health effects. These businesses can emit PM 2.5, which is small particulate matter that can get in the lungs and cause various ailments. There's hazardous air pollutants that can cause various effects such as cancer. And so some of the action items that we need to consider, more regulations on these emissions by the EPA. And sometimes these emitters don't even have to measure the amount of pollutants that they're putting into the environment. They just have to do certain practices to show that they're trying to remove pollutants from the environment. So we don't even know what's actually out there in the environment. So we need to do community level pollution monitoring to see what concentrations of pollutants people are actually getting exposed to. And that's where some of the research that I'm currently doing here at WashU falls into. So on the left is a map that I produced, but first of all, I want to talk when emissions are coming out of the environment. They can travel in the atmosphere due to some meteorological conditions, such as the wind, that can cause it to disperse and travel in certain directions. So if you look at the wind patterns and the overall weather patterns of certain areas, such as in Missouri, you can be able to figure out how pollution spreads in a certain area. So on the left is a map that I created for the St. Louis City area of a specific chemical. And you can see it's a dark concentrated area. This is more likely where a pollution source is. And due to weather conditions, it spreads out and potentially affects the surrounding census tracts. And so businesses need to be held accountable for the potential exposure that they're causing others to be experiencing. And so we need more monitoring in these census tracts to be able to figure out what exposures people are actually getting exposed to. And so some of the research that I want to do, so I'm a first year PhD student, I'm starting to get started with research. So these are projects that I'm trying to get developed, is doing some community level monitoring. But it's quite expensive to do high quality air pollution monitoring because sensors can be very costly to implement at a large scale. It can be thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. So sometimes you can do nature-based solutions. So want to be able to integrate green spaces in places of concern where there could be pollution. And plants can do phytoremediation. They can clean the air. They can remove pollutants in the water, in the soil, because air pollution, it travels. It just doesn't stay in the air. It can get in the soil. And then when water contacts the soil, it gets in the water supply as well. And you can use plants to actually biomonitor pollutants as well. So plants have a delicate balance of how they interact with each other. And if there's any outside interferences, it can cause changes. So what I'm interested in is trying to develop some landscape systems where there's such a delicate balance where if a pollutant of concern is a high enough concentration in that environment, you can see some noticeable changes happening in the landscape and use that to be able to predict whether or not pollutions of concern are happening in that area. And so again, we need solutions that tackle two problems at once. So using green spaces to protect people from pollutants, but also using it to increase the amount of green spaces in the area, create more community gathering spaces. These have multiple benefits. So does anyone have any ideas on what are the benefits of having community gathering spaces or green spaces in majority Black areas in St. Louis?
I was just gonna say it would have better air climate there, so like the air would no longer be polluted with certain, chemicals and materials.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. I just saw a comment in chat from William Winston, and Mr. Winston, you want to go ahead and just raise your question, please, unmute?
Yeah, sure. Sure, I'd be happy to. Hi, Tyler. Again, I was just curious about the map that you showed for the trichloromethane. I'm curious, A, was that an average measurement? When was it measured, and were they regularly spaced measurements? I guess it's just really not clear from that map how when did it happen, that sort of thing.
Sorry, I didn't know if I should get into the details of everything because of the background of the audience. But this is actually from EPA modeled emissions. So they took the National Emissions Inventory Assessment. So again, these companies are required to release their emission inventories. And so the EPA models based on how much emissions are happening at this point source and uses meteorological data to be able to predict how it disperses in the environment. And so they have these estimated concentrations in census tracts. So this is just a tool to be able to predict what concentrations are, and work would have to be done to actually go at that census tract and measure to see whether or not the model is correct with what we're seeing in real life.
Excellent, thank you very much.
Okay, I saw an interesting comment from Henning. Henning, would you please, if you don't mind, share your comment with the group and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Henning Losebusch, and I work at the Geospatial Institute at St. Louis University. And I just love the idea of, I guess, two solutions with one stone or with one gathering space, of using a space for social community gatherings, and then the idea of using plants as sort of a pollution sensor is brilliant, and certainly GIS and remote sensing are great tools to look at the health of plants. So that's a great idea in my book.
All right, thank you.
And I'm also wondering, in general, there are more than weather stations. They're actually weather stations and sort of measuring some very rough ways, but measuring some criteria pollutants. So this goes back to sort of automotive regulated pollutants that could be placed around cities to measure some of these pollution issues real time almost, that connect through the Internet of Things. I believe Columbus and maybe even Chicago had some pilot projects around this. This could also be a good use of maybe some of these recovery funds to at least gain a better appreciation of what these levels truly are on a day-to-day basis. So great idea. I love the presentation in general.
Thank you, Henning, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, if not, let's go ahead with the next slide. Tyler?
Good, so thanks everybody for the feedback. And just to say, yeah, low cost sensors, it was mentioned, the application of those are becoming much more practical because of their lower cost. They're more widely be able to be used. So you're able to see the spatial variation of pollutions in real time, like you said. And so another aspect of air pollution that we want to look at with environmental racism are sources such as roadways and traffic. So on the right is a map of some roadways of St. Louis City area. And what we find is that proximity to traffic is of course related to proximity to roadways, but these roadways are more likely to be near areas that are majority Black. And I asked a similar question beforehand, but why is this the case? Again, it's related to, there's reasons why roads are placed in certain places. These are decisions made by people in power, and they don't want to disturb or make people angry that they don't want to make angry. So they're putting preference towards, for example, more privileged communities who have more money, who they want to favor, but these disprivileged communities, they don't really care about their concerns or the effects of that. So these racist policies happen that put these roadways in these areas, more traffic, and then put people at risk of being exposed to the emissions from vehicles in these roadways. So again, vehicle emissions such as PM 2.5, there's carbon black, and hazardous air pollutions put people at risk. And one of the other research projects that I'm working on with the Sustainability Office and Catherine Werner, she's the sustainability director for St. Louis, and an advisor here, is looking at the impact of pollution from vehicles on people who are near the areas. And by doing this, we're looking at the plans that Metro have to replace the buses on 70 Grand, the diesel buses that are there, to replace them with just electric busing. So 70 Grand runs north and south. So a variety of people are exposed to pollutants. So, you get more up north, more Black people, more down south, more white people. But it opens up the opportunity to see how air quality changes before and after implementing the new busing. So this could be used as a tool to try and push incentives to try and transform transportation from being gas powered to electric powered, because it could have a potential health impact. And we're going to do this by measuring carbon black near bus stops to predict pedestrian exposure. So that carbon black is what you see on the bottom right photo. It typically comes, when a bus starts from a stop, there's incomplete combustion, so all that black soot comes in the air. So measuring near bus stops to try and predict pedestrian exposure, but of course it's going to be related to who's more near roadways, who's more likely to use buses and be at bus stops, which again is probably going to be Black people. So we're going to see trying to quantify just how much exposure people are getting to this black carbon, and thus use that as a motive to encourage transformation of vehicles to being electric powered. And all of these air pollution categories that we talked about lead in the air, we talked about mold, we talked about PM 2.5, all these types of emissions have impacts. And so we see here are some of these effects. So GIS is a very powerful tool to be able to let you visualize the effects of this environmental racism. So these two graphs are related to asthma-related hospitalizations per zip code on the left, and on the right are asthma-related ER visits on the right. And of course you would expect, from what I showed, the places that have more exposure to air pollution risks are thus going to be have a higher tendency of getting these negative health impacts due to exposure to air pollution. So we have in the north side of St. Louis, typically, the darker red means higher hospitalization visits and higher ER visits. And these effects can be used as a tool to quantify the impacts of environmental racism and try and put pressure on people to show why change needs to happen. So we need to think about the impacts of environmental racism, put a cost on it. It's unfortunate, but people think in money, people think in capital terms. So for example, asthma attacks and hospital visits, what impact do they have? So in order for people to resolve their asthma issues, they may need to get inhalers, but that requires insurance, which is costly. Some people may not have the money to do that, so they may not get inhalers. So then they become more susceptible to their asthma and thus may be more at risk to these health effects. For those who are able to go to the ER, that creates a strain on the medical system. Those are hospital costs. And parents that have to take their children, that's loss of work days. These children have asthma attacks, that's loss of school days. Someone has an asthma attack, that's loss of morale. And loss of morale may affect someone's effort, may affect someone's productivity. So many changes happen in someone's life can cause a capital impact because of environmental racism. You see it with lead poisoning as well, similar effects. Someone might have to use their insurance, increases hospital costs. We're talking about loss of educational attainment due to the intellectual developments that are deprogressed due to lead. So people may have been doctors, maybe construction workers, but not able to do that because they weren't able to get what they wanted out of education. They're losing workforce value. And as we see, a potential increase in criminal activity as well. So putting impacts and putting numbers on environmental racism impacts, it's what's needed to be done. So we put more pressure on people to solve these environmental racism issues. And there's more work that needs to be done on figuring out what is the actual number for the impact of environmental racism. So trying to figure out how some solutions can happen. So again, we're going to look on the right. This is a figure, St. Louis City. Again, we have a leader of a ward here. He's talking about abandoned buildings. On the right are the number of vacated buildings, potentially vacated buildings or vacated buildings completely in the St. Louis City area. So the more gray you see, that means the more potential vacated areas. And we see it's typically happening in the north side of St. Louis. So it's an area that's neglected, that's been ignored. And on the left, this is related to the debris and illegal dumping complaints that happen in the area. So as we see, the more vacated areas there are, the more debris and illegal dumping complaints there are. So people are seeing these vacated sites and just using them to deposit waste. They say, I don't want to pay for throwing away waste, so I might as well just use this area that no one cares about and throw away waste. So you can think about what that does for people in the community when they see their area just being used as a landfill in a sense. And so their environment has the same value as a landfill. So you can think about what that does to morale. But there's potential projects for these abandoned buildings, and we have to think about this. And we could think about revitalizing these abandoned buildings and try and solve environmental racism issues. So for example, St. Louis City will receive $500 million. It was brought up by Laura, actually. She brought this up. So this is what it said we're going to be talking about. It's going to receive $500 million in federal relief aid due to COVID. So this money could be used in good means to try and bring value out of these abandoned buildings. So for example, what if we renovated them to serve as temporary places of stay for people dealing with unsafe living conditions? If someone finds out they have lead in their home, they have mold in their home, probably not going to want to stay there. So they need temporary places to stay while the solution gets fixed. Or what if they serve as office space for legal counselors that work to fight against environmental racism? So once you have these services in close proximity to communities, they know services are more available, they're more likely to use them, and hold people accountable to try and figure out how they can get these environmental racism issues solved. So with this money, like we talked about, Tashara Jones, the new mayor, going to have some probably very progressive initiatives, but we want to, again, still hold her accountable to figure out how this money is being used. So we should think about how these abandoned buildings could be revitalized. So do people have thoughts on how these abandoned buildings could be used?
Anyone? Tyler just opened with another question.
Tyler, Tom Bast, Clyde C. Miller. I was thinking as a follow-up to the green spaces, one area that we've seen some growth in the last few years has been urban farming. And I just wondered what your thoughts were, if that could be a counteractive but productive tool for trying to alleviate some of these pollution issues that we're fighting.
Oh, absolutely, that's a great idea. So again, we talked about increased vegetation potentially serving as a sink for air pollution, cleaning the air. But you could also solve two problems at once. Food scarcity is an environmental racism issue as well. These people living in these impoverished areas don't have access to transportation, so it's typically harder for them to get food. So if we could use buildings, for example, even do indoor farming. So farming can happen more year round, increase access to healthy foods. This could potentially solve environmental racism issues as well. So that's a great idea.
Okay. So in essence, what you are saying, Tyler, because I think that I'm glad that Tom brought this up, and that is that the increase of urban farming could also address the food scarcity issue and also alleviate some of the urban deserts that exist in North St. Louis. Am I capturing that right? Because I think there was a little problem with the sound for you, Tyler, just now. So am I saying it right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. How am I sounding now? Am I still a little patchy or what?
Okay. Okay. Anyone else?
Tyler, I would add that one of our neighbors to the northeast, Detroit, Michigan, already has experience in reclaiming large swaths of deteriorated buildings and returning it to agriculture. So I think that would be a good source for some research information from people who already have experience in doing this. I think some of it could apply. We probably don't have quite the number of acres that Detroit has available for such reclamation, but I think what they did is worth studying.
All right, thank you, Alderman-elect Page. Anyone else? Okay, Tyler, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I want to say thank you, everyone, for that input. And again, sorry if my audio's acting up. I don't know what's going on, but I'll try and repeat things if possible. But again, this is where I want to get to the conclusion of things. So what we've seen so far is environmental racism issues are multifaceted, stem from neglect and racist policies and actions. It's multifaceted in that it affects various types of areas and has various exposure pathways, and happens because people either choose directly to privilege certain areas and not other areas, or they just choose not to act at all. But solving these issues should be coupled with economic issues. We know people who are living in impoverished areas are more likely to experience environmental racism. So to solve one, you have to solve the other as well. And GIS is a powerful tool because you're able to show how these disparities look visually. It makes it so that people can't ignore these problems. They have to see how it's playing out. So for something like lead that seems invisible, so if you try and show someone lead poisoning or try and show someone lead in their home, they really can't see it. But if you collect this data and then display it with GIS, you can see the disparities and it becomes unable to be ignored. And so one of the lasting messages that I want to leave with people is that it's important to stay reflective and informed about other types of environmental racism you perceive in your day-to-day lives. I started this presentation by saying I like going around Forest Park and riding my bike. And while doing that, I see the various types of avenues that are available for people to express themselves. There's various types of sports fields. Let's see, people can play handball, people can bike, people can ice skate, people can play cricket. One thing I haven't seen in Forest Park is basketball courts, or a sport that's probably one of the most popular in America, for that to not even be available in Forest Park. These seem like targeted decisions, as if they're trying to exclude people. So these are the actions, the neglect that we have to consider. So think about these things in your day-to-day lives and think about how you could potentially use GIS to visualize this, to show disparities. So thank you all for being attentive. And anyone has any questions, I will feel free to answer.
Okay, at this point, I do know that Laura brought up an interesting suggestion. And Laura, are you able to unmute and share that with us? I know we haven't talked about it.
Yeah, I am, just real quick, and I hate to detract from questions directly for Tyler. I hate it when people say more of a comment, but this is just a comment. There's a really fabulous artist who has been in residency at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation who's doing work on environmental racism related to gardening and urban green space. I believe he's Des Moines based. I have not been able to go to anything connected to it, but I did throw the link in the chat. So I think it's worth, you know, Tyler, you've made a great, compelling argument how ArcGIS helps us understand this on a level, but I think it's nice to think about the ways in which creative practice can also complement that consciousness raising, that public education piece.
And I like the fact that you brought up how this particular artist is tackling, you know, an issue that we just talked about in regards to the importance of urban farming and how it can counter some of the environmental problems that we are faced with in North St. Louis. So I appreciate you sharing it with us, Laura or Dr. Cullen. Anyone else have any questions or comments at this point?
Yes, I would like to chime in with a comment. First thing I want to say, Tyler, you did an amazing job. I truly was moved by your presentation and your information, and I would love to partner with you and work with you in any way possible to assist you going forward. So definitely keep that in mind. And the last thing I would like to say is that I grew up as a kid going to Forest Park, and I remember when there were basketball goals there, and I remember when they took them out. So you're right on point with what you're saying. Definitely, like you said, I was just in Forest Park yesterday biking. I saw people playing golf, tennis, walking their dogs. I mean, and it's a very diverse and multicultural park, but no basketball goes. So you were right on with that. So keep me in mind in the future, and I would love to connect with you outside of this meeting to see how I can assist you and we can develop a partnership.
Thank you very much for that. That reminds me, I want to leave my information in the chat, so I'll go ahead and leave my email right now. Love to hear back from people and see how we could all collaborate.
Okay, while Tyler's putting his contact information in chat, is there any other question, comment, or suggestion?
So this is Henning again. I just want to join in and say that it was a really great presentation and eye-opening in many ways. This reminded me that Harris-Stowe State University has a urban agriculture program. I think that's trying to work a similar angle.
Okay, you're right. More partnership with some of the universities as well as nonprofit organizations, and of course, like Dr. Cullen or Laura pointed out, even with some of our arts foundations like Publisher and some of the other ones that are working with artists who are addressing some of these problems within our community. Anyone else? Tyler's put his information in for those of you who may not see it yet, but he has his email address as C as in charles.tyler@washu.edu. And of course, his telephone number is 316-371-7562. I repeat, his telephone number is 316-371-7562. Okay, so let's go. Is there anyone else? I think I heard someone.
Yeah, let me just say real quick, I accidentally put the wrong thing on the end of the email. It's actually the last one, the wustl.edu.
Okay.
Actually.
Okay. So you want to repeat then, just to be sure that everyone who may have not seen your email address in the chat.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I see it as c.tyler@wustl.edu. Okay. All right. So without much further ado, I want to thank everyone who took the time today to be a part of this forum on GIS, air pollution, and environmental racism, and also looking at the value of GIS, a geographic information system mapping tool, as a way to help visualize a lot of the problems and perhaps even find ways to provide solutions. So without taking much more time, I want to thank you all again so very much for being a part of today's Gateway GIS Virtual Forum with Tyler Cargill from Washington University in St. Louis, who is a chemical engineering doctoral student there. Thank you very much, and you all have a wonderful day, and bye-bye.